Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Asian American labor movements and discussing the question, how has being Asian American in America affected people's economic opportunities? So, I just want to start off with this quick do now. Think about the following questions for a minute. Just pause the video. What is a union? What does it mean to unionize? What is collective bargaining? Why might a union be more effective than a single worker negotiating with their employer? So just pause the video for a second. Okay. So a union is a group of workers that typically work in the same industry or workplace that come together to negotiate different things with their employer. So unionizing means a group of workers form a union and collectively bargain to achieve their demands. So collective bargaining is working together as a group to demand the same thing. So rather than me, a worker, asking my employer for, let's say, 10 hours of paid time off every year, my whole workplace works together to fight for that paid time off. And this is typically more effective than a single worker because a single worker can just be fired, you don't really have any power with your employer. But a whole workplace can't be fired at the same time because then business would stop. So it's more effective to negotiate as a group. So the first event that I'd like to talk about is the court case Yikwo v. Hopkins, which happened in 1886. In 1880, San Francisco required all laundries in wooden buildings to get a permit, and the Board of Supervisors of San Francisco had total control of who received a permit. They could just pick and choose who received it and not give it to people for arbitrary reasons. Even though 89% of laundries were owned by Chinese Americans, no permits were granted to Chinese businesses. So Yikwo and Wo Li were two owners of laundry businesses, and they were forced to operate it legally because they weren't issued permits, despite the fact that their business was pretty standard. They were asked to pay a $10 fine, and they refused and were arrested. Both of them sued, claiming that the law was enforced discriminatorily because it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, which, just to remind you, states that there can be no discrimination based off of race, sex, gender, or any other reason. So the Supreme Court of California and the California District Circuit Court ruled against them because they stated that since the law itself was non-discriminatory, but the application of the law was, the EPC didn't apply because they said the EPC only was related to the law itself rather than its application. It only applied to the law itself. The case eventually went to the Supreme Court, where the court ruled unanimously in favor of Yikwo and Wo Li, and it stated that because the enforcement was biased, it violated the 14th Amendment. And it was the first use of the 14th Amendment to strike down a law that was enforced with bias. So this next major event was the Delano Grape Strike from 1965 to 1970. On May 3rd, 1965, Filipino farm workers working in Coachella Valley, California as grape pickers striked for better wages and successfully negotiated a 40-cent per hour raise. Since these workers worked as seasonal workers and moved from farm to farm based off of what produce was being picked at the time, they moved to Delano, California, where they were only paid $1.20 per hour below the federal minimum wage. So on September 7, 1965, their union, the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee, or AWOC, voted to go on strike. More than 1,000 Filipino farm workers striked. On the right here, you can see an image of the Filipino workers as well as the AFL-CIO and the United Farm Workers of the USA, which was led by Cesar Chavez, which striked with them. So the grape growers hired Mexican farm workers to break the strike, and the leader of the AWOC, Larry Itliong, approached Cesar Chavez, the leader of the National Farm Workers Association, NFWA, and asked for their help on the strike. On September 16th, 1965, the Mexican farm workers joined the Filipinos at the picket line, and the strikers were nonviolent and attracted national support. And they also successfully pushed a national boycott of Delano grapes. In 1966, the AWOC and the NFWA officially merged, creating the United Farm Workers. And you can see on the right a United Farm Workers grape strike. After 5 years of strikes, the strikes ended when the grape growers signed contracts with the labor unions at the higher wage. Next, we have the Jiangsai garment workers strike of 1974. On the right here, you can see garment workers. San Francisco in the 1960s and 70s was full of garment manufacturing. Factories would hire mostly immigrants to work in sweatshop conditions, and they got away with a lot of labor violations because immigrants often didn't speak the language or they were afraid of going to police. Jiangsai was one such clothing factory, and it was owned by Esprit de Corps, and the owner, Douglas Hopkins, was anti-union. Workers were harassed and intimidated to prevent them from speaking about their working conditions. Work was sped up, there were few breaks, low wages, and the workers were disrespected, and the majority of the workforce was Chinese American women. On July 4th, 1974, 4 workers began distributing union information and were fired. Tompkins, who was the boss, threatened the workers to prevent them from unionizing. On July 15th, the workers striked, and on July 17th, Tompkins closed the factory. Strikers were arrested, hit by a truck driven by one of Tompkins' men, and were harassed by police. Finally, in December 1975, the factory was forced to take back their workers and pay them fairly with back pay, which meant they were paid for all the days that they striked, and improve the factory conditions by a court order. So on the right here, you can see the women striking for better wages. So we also have the 1982 garment workers strike. So the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 removed quotas established based on nation of origin, which really sought to ban Asian immigration, and it resulted in an influx of immigrants, including Asian immigrants. This increase in immigration revitalized the dying U.S. garment industry because it created jobs for anyone who wanted a job. They didn't need to know English. By the late 1970s, 4 in 10 Chinese families had members working in the garment industry. By 1980, in New York City, 25,000 Chinese garment workers were employed by 430 shops, and women made up over 80% of this workforce. However, working conditions were poor. The buildings were old, neglected, and overcrowded. There was poor ventilation, dehydration, and stressful 10-hour workdays, which caused a lot of health problems like tuberculosis and kidney and gastric problems. So essentially, they were working in sweatshop conditions. The workers were paid piece by piece, allowing employers to pay them below the minimum wage. So they were paid 50 cents a piece and earned about $5,500 annually. In 1982, contractors refused to agree to contracts agreed upon by the manufacturers and unions. They threatened to take away holidays and benefits, so the workers were outraged and began organizing in preparation for the strike that began on June 24th, 1982. Over 20,000 workers striked. They marched through New York City's Chinatown to Columbus Park, where union officials and workers delivered speeches. And on the right here, you can see them marching through Chinatown with banners and signs that are all pro-union. After the speeches, the workers continued to march, and by the end of the day, all but one shop had signed the contract. The strike caused employers to stop wage cuts and stop threatening to take away holidays and benefits, and it led to workers receiving bilingual staff, English classes, and transportation services to and from work. So, just to finish up, I want you to think about this exit slip. Why do you think poor working conditions like this still existed in the 1970s and 1980s? Do you think the race of their workers had anything to do with how companies treated their employees? So just pause the video and think about that for a second. Okay, so why do I think poor working conditions like this still existed in the 1970s and 1980s. Well, by the 1970s and the 1980s, the pro union atmosphere was kind of dying down. Unions were being blamed for the poor economy. And there was a lot of anti union politics going on. So many pro union policies and laws were either uh, repealed or other laws were passed that invalidated them. So it allowed employers to get away with a lot of things and a lot of poor conditions. And it was especially helped by the fact that many of these workers were immigrants. And so the overall government didn't really care about them because they were seen as, job stealing. So the race of the workers definitely had something to do with the way they were treated by their employers, because their employers could get away with treating them worse because they didn't really have anyone to protect them. So, despite all that, the fact they were able to make unions and fight for their rights, and it really shows the importance of working solidarity. So, solidarity between workers, and also just the importance of unions and how important they are to making sure that people get fair wages and fair working conditions. So, once again, I will be linking the primary sources in the description, and thank you so much for joining me yet again.